Brenda Powell was born March 19, 1969 in Salem, Ohio, and was a born educator. Even from a very young age, she loved working with children and had a deep interest in caring for others. Now, naturally, as she progressed in her education, she oriented her studies around her passion for caring, and so it was no surprise that after graduating from the University of Akron with a degree in nursing, she worked at a nearby medical facility called Akron Children's Hospital. Here, Brenda's skill and calmness were recognized as she worked with children of all ages. For the next 28 years, she worked at this hospital. She also continued to develop the department's adolescent oncology program and planned outreach events for families and children to celebrate every step on the road to a cure for cancer. Brenda was a legend at this hospital, and both the children and co-workers just adored her. She was like a second mother to many, treating the children she cared for as if they were her own. Focused on her personal life, Brenda was a happily married woman with 2 children. Her husband, Steve, described her as deeply committed to her work, friends, and family. After meeting in 1995, it didn't take long for the couple to bond in marriage. Shortly after their wedding, they learned that they would soon become parents. The couple named their daughter Sydney, and a few years later they had a son who was named Andrew. The family of 4 lived happily and peacefully in Akron, Ohio. Brenda and Steve were financially secure, which meant that the family didn't have much to worry about when it came to money. They had created a stable and happy home for their children, and it was hoped that they would end up as healthy as their home environment. Sydney and Andrew were born into a Catholic family, and as for education, Sydney first attended St. Sebastian Elementary School and then graduated from St. Vincent High School in 2018. During high school, Sydney performed extremely well. She was friendly, but not outspoken. Everyone liked her, but she didn't go out of her way to draw attention to herself. At first glance, she may have seemed insecure. Friends said that when they first met her, she seemed shy. But as time went on and she grew to sympathize with them, her personality came out in all its glory. She was a talented athlete. After high school, Sydney decided to attend the University of Mount Union, which was about an hour away from Akron. In her mind, it was far enough away for her to have space, but also close enough to get back to her family if she needed them. Due to her success in high school, Sydney was awarded the Mount Union Scholarship, which she gladly accepted. Although saying goodbye to her parents was bittersweet, deep down she knew they were never far from her. Speaking of her parents, Sydney had enjoyed a great relationship with both of them in her youth. And while she did get along very well with her father, she was incredibly close to her mother, Brenda. They had a very good relationship, and Sydney often went to her for advice and conversation. Sydney's first semester at university started off very, very well, and she lived with her best friend from high school named Lauren. As the first semester progressed, Sydney found that it was pretty easy for her to come out of her shell and meet a lot of new people. She joined a sorority, met more people on campus, and gained confidence. From the outside, it seemed like nothing could stop her from spending an incredible 4 years at Mount Union. But unfortunately, that soon fell apart. For the next 3 semesters, Sydney excelled in her academic work, passing each course brilliantly while making many new friends among her peers. During the summers, she would return home to reconnect with her family and work at Akron at the same time. When it came to studying at Mount Union, students could track their progress through an online portal. Here, they could also review their curricula, get in touch with professors, and plan group classes. Parents also had access to this portal where they could pay tuition, contact the school administration, and stay updated on events related to the college and its students. However, they wouldn't automatically see their children's grades. Although Sydney's parents could theoretically have requested to view the grades if they wanted, they knew their daughter was doing well academically. She had performed so well in high school that they believed she was maintaining those high grades in college too. Sydney also hadn't warned her parents about any issues, so when her father, Steve, logged into the portal in January 2020 to pay her tuition, he didn't even bother to check her grades. However, strangely enough, after entering his usual login details, he was immediately logged out and couldn't log back in. Informing Sydney about the situation, she promised to contact the college administration and sort things out. But a month later, in February 2020, He still couldn't log in to pay the tuition and was increasingly worried that something might be wrong with the system, so he reached out to the administration to see if they could help him. Calling the Student Relations Office on March 3rd, Steve thought he would likely be able to resolve the issue without any trouble. However, what he eventually learned was completely unexpected. The reason he couldn't pay the tuition was that Sydney was no longer enrolled at the university. And now Steve was left wondering what had happened to his daughter. Surely this must be one huge mistake. What could have happened that made his daughter suddenly drop out of school? After all, she had worked as a teacher for so long throughout her education. Like any concerned parent, he kept asking questions, but the Mount Union administration quickly shut him down. They claimed that the nature of this information was only available to Sydney, and if he wanted to know more, he would have to talk to his daughter. What he didn't know was that Sydney had actually been suspended since December 2019, following her failure on 3 out of 4 exams during the fall semester of her sophomore year. While that sounded serious, technically it didn't necessarily have to mark the end of Sydney's college career. Her suspension was only for 1 semester, and she could have proven herself again by enrolling in the next semester if she wanted to. Now, when a Mount Union student gets suspended, they receive a letter detailing the suspension process and the steps to take next. This letter is extremely important for the student, as it must be signed, dated, and then returned to the university for re-enrollment. Sydney did receive this letter, but why did she decide not to sign and return it? That doesn't mean she didn't want to study there, because even after her suspension, she continued living on campus as if nothing had happened. What's even stranger is that during this time, she even kept attending classes, going to sorority meetings, and hanging out with friends. However, it's no surprise that this clearly went against school rules. And so, quite soon, Sydney found herself face to face with the administrative board. At first glance, it seemed that they understood her situation. It makes perfect sense that a student might find it hard to accept their new reality. To provide an extra level of comfort, the administration even offered to help Sydney inform her parents about the news. Instead, she lied to the board, saying that her parents already knew about her suspension but were on an extended vacation and therefore couldn't help her move out of the dorm. But after their 3rd meeting with Sydney, she had no choice, and on February 24th, she was being evicted and had to move out. Still unable to face her parents, she decided to stay in nearby motels until March 3rd, and sure enough, that was when her dad, Steve, found out about the web of lies. Shocked and confused by this news, Steve hung up before checking Sydney's location. The family used a shared tracking app to keep each other safe and know where they were, and that's when he found out that Sydney had returned to the family home. But before going home, Steve called his wife Brenda to inform her about this very strange and concerning situation. Unsurprisingly, they were both unhappy. Their daughter had essentially flunked out of college and then lied about it for weeks. How would you feel if your child treated you this way? Instead of getting too upset, Steve asked Brenda to meet him at home after she finished work, while he tried to understand Sydney's perspective on the story. Leaving his phone at the office so Sydney wouldn't notice his arrival, he drove home. Arriving after 11:30 and facing Sydney, she quickly gave in. She told her dad that all her friends seemed to have already figured everything out. They were striving to achieve meaningful degrees, had tangible goals, and were actively making progress toward their dreams. But unfortunately, Sydney no longer felt that way. And when she compared herself to the people around her, she felt like a failure. While we're busy doubting ourselves, the people around us are either fascinated or even scared by our full potential. Sometimes, in moments of self-doubt, you need to focus on the opinions of those who love you instead of your own. Steve understood this and knew just how smart his daughter really was. He reassured her that if she put in a little effort, they could help get her back on track together. Feeling better, Steve suggested she talk to her mom when she got home. But as for himself, he needed to get back to the office. Upon returning to work, Steve received a text from Brenda. She had left work early to head home and arrived around 12:15 a.m. 26 minutes later, at 12:41, Steve texted, "What did you discuss with Sydney?" Unfortunately, he would never receive a reply. Just 10 minutes later, one of his friends, who worked as a detective at the local police department, called Steve to check if everything was okay because he had apparently heard that officers had just been sent to their house. Something was wrong. What Steve and the police didn't realize was that at that moment, Brenda was walking into the family home to talk to her daughter. At that moment, she was on the phone. While the Mount Union officers were talking to Brenda, they suddenly heard a loud argument and some very alarming noises. Shouts echoed over the phone line, followed by several dull thuds, then a loud crack, and then the phone line suddenly went dead. Concerned for Brenda's safety, the officers immediately called 911, and then they tried to call Brenda back several times, and after multiple attempts, they finally reached her. But the person on the line wasn't Brenda. It was someone posing as her. The staff immediately realized it was Sydney. After she heard that the police were already on their way, Sydney abruptly hung up. Steve, who was still unaware of the situation, began to panic. He had just recently been at the house, so what could have happened in the hour he was gone? Desperately calling his wife and daughter, Steve made several phone calls before finally getting an answer. Sydney's voice was filled with terror as she said that someone had broken into the house. When Kenneth and the other officers arrived at the scene at 19 Scudder Drive, it was complete chaos. The house was in total disarray. Numerous windows were shattered, and there were bloodstains everywhere. Sydney was found desperately crying in the driveway. The girl seemed completely out of her mind, scratching the asphalt so hard that her nails tore and started to bleed. The police took her to a quieter place to calm her down, and as soon as she managed to calm down enough, she told them what had supposedly happened. Sydney claimed that while she was talking to her mother about her school grades, an armed stranger suddenly burst into the house. Then Brenda told Sydney to run for help, but when she returned, she found her mother lifeless on the ground. Apparently, she had suffered several stab wounds and was bleeding profusely. Paramedics took Brenda to the hospital. They confirmed that she had been stabbed over 36 times and had also sustained a blunt force trauma to the back of the head. Unfortunately, the extent of her injuries was too severe, and shortly after arriving at the hospital, she was pronounced dead. Meanwhile, at the crime scene, the police were still trying to piece together exactly what had happened. The house was completely wrecked, and there were clear signs of a struggle. The furniture was overturned and broken, and there were bloodstains visible in many rooms. For the investigators, the story Sydney was telling was growing increasingly fabricated and suspicious. The first thing they noticed was that her hands were covered in blood, and they quickly observed that she also had wounds on her face and torso. On top of that, the police soon noticed that most of the windows appeared to have been broken from the inside rather than the outside, suggesting a staged break-in. It didn't take them long to conclude that Sydney was likely behind the attack, and their doubts only intensified after authorities learned about Brenda's phone call. Such a grim realization would surely split the family in two for the second time in the same day. Both Steve and Andrew were just starting to come to terms with the loss of their mother and wife, and now they were facing the loss of Sydney in an entirely different way. So, what really happened in that house? Did Sydney methodically and cold-bloodedly kill her mother, or did she spiral out of control in a psychotic state? On April 6th, Cindy Powell was officially charged with murder, robbery, and tampering with evidence. On April 17th, after she pleaded not guilty, the judge set her bail at $25,000 with maximum pretrial supervision and a mental health evaluation. Sydney was sent to live with her grandparents under their very close watch, with daily check-ins from the police to ensure she was behaving appropriately. After being assessed by a medical professional, Sydney's lawyer changed her plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. This significantly delayed the trial, and the Summit County prosecutor requested a second mental evaluation. To begin the legal proceedings, it was necessary to clearly determine whether Sydney had intentionally attacked her mother or if she had experienced a mental breakdown at the time of the killing. Despite the horrific murder, Sydney's family continued to support her up until the trial began. According to Steve, the Powell family was fully convinced that their daughter was not in her right mind during the murder. Now that she was on medication and under supervision, she had returned to her usual state and seemed no longer a danger to society. The 10-day trial against her started on September 7, 2023. and many witnesses were called to testify, including one of Sydney's attorneys, teachers, staff who spoke with Brenda on the phone the day she died, and numerous mental health experts. On the first day of her trial, both sides presented their arguments. Sydney's defense team claimed that she was dealing with undiagnosed schizophrenia and was out of control during the psychotic breakdown when she killed her mother, which justified her insanity plea. They also pointed out the lack of motive and that such overt cruelty was completely out of character for her. This was just not something Sydney would do if she were in her right mind. On the other hand, the prosecution argued that Sydney was fully aware of what she was doing. The attempt to cover up the crime and the effort to impersonate her mother over the phone were clear signs that a rational person was trying to mislead the investigation. Sydney's father took the stand and detailed the events of that day leading up to the murder. Friends and colleagues of Brenda also spoke about the shocking murder and how, to their knowledge, the mother and daughter had a very close relationship. Representatives from Mount Union testified that they heard repeated dull thuds and screams during the conversation with Brenda Powell, which tragically came to an end. It was probably that very moment when she was attacked. Fraser indicated that the conversation ended about a minute and a half after the incident. He tried calling back, but on the third attempt, Sydney picked up the phone, introducing herself as her mother. Sydney's roommate and best friend Lauren also testified in court. She claimed that before the murder, there didn't seem to be anything wrong with Sydney and that there was no animosity between her and her mother. She also stated that she saw Sydney just a day before the murder, on March 2nd, at a party, and apparently, Sydney seemed just as cheerful as usual. The next 5 days of Sydney's trial were dedicated to exploring her mental state on the day of her mother's murder, involving several psychologists who shared their opinions on what might have happened. Dr. Swale testified that Sydney was out of her mind at the time and diagnosed her with bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, and acute psychosis. Dr. Ridden, who also evaluated her in 2021, agreed that she had a severe mental illness. Furthermore, he testified that the spontaneity, brutality, and lack of motive in the attack suggested she experienced some sort of mental breakdown. On the other hand, clinical psychologist Dr. Sylvia Obradovich concluded that Sydney was faking or exaggerating her mental illness to avoid responsibility. She explained that the best source of information for assessing insanity is what was said and felt during the incident, and in this case, it simply didn't seem like schizophrenia. She also noted that Sydney reported experiencing symptoms at the age of 11 that made her condition extremely severe. Both sides presented quite compelling arguments, but on September 20th, 2023, after deliberating for 9 hours and 23 minutes, the verdict was finally rendered. The jury unanimously found 23-year-old Cindy Powell guilty of murder, robbery, and tampering with evidence. On September 28th, a week later, Sydney appeared in court for the last time for sentencing. In the end, she was sentenced to an indefinite term of 15 years to life in prison for killing her mother. Many people who followed the trial online were quite outraged by Sydney's family, who provided her with constant support throughout the proceedings. Most of Sydney's family believed she wasn't in her right mind at the time of her mother's murder, and her father still thinks she should be free from the justice system. Regardless of her mental state, murder is still murder, and she has to answer for her actions. What's absolutely clear is who she is now, and Sydney will spend many years of her life behind bars.